If you're familiar with the Final Fantasy series, you know that it has a very strange history in terms of releases on the NES and the SNES. There were 3 games that were released in Japan that were not released elsewhere. Final Fantasy 2, 3, and 5 were all unreleased in the West until much later. To complicate matters further, Square renamed the Final Fantasy games that were released in the West to minimize confusion, at least in the short term. This means that Final Fantasy 4 and 6 were released as Final Fantasy 2 and 3 in North America. If you're someone like me who lived through that period, then it's a bit confusing at times. For example, as I'm reviewing Final Fantasy 2 here, it's hard for me not to snap to thinking about Final Fantasy 4, since growing up, that was Final Fantasy 2 to me. The real Final Fantasy 2 is a game I've never played all the way through until now. So was it worth the wait to play, or is it a game that is better left forgotten? Final Fantasy II Pixel Remaster is a turn-based RPG developed by Square Enix. The pixel remastered version of Final Fantasy II was released in 2021 for PC and mobile, and in 2023 for PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch. This is, of course, a remake of the original Final Fantasy II that was released in 1988 for the Famicom in Japan. Final Fantasy II Pixel Remaster costs $11.99 on all storefronts. The game is rated E10 for fantasy violence, mild language, things like that. I would very much agree with this rating, as there isn't much offensive to be found in Final Fantasy II. I was actually fairly impressed with the story of Final Fantasy II. I would say that overall, the story is better than the first game in the series. While there were interesting aspects to the story of that first game, it often felt very ill-defined and lacking in structure. Final Fantasy II changes that with quite an impressive story and way of telling that story for a game that debuted on the Famicom. Final Fantasy II, unlike the first game, presents us with the main villain of the game right from the start. The Emperor of Palamacia, with the help of demonic forces, is seeking to conquer the world and bring everything under his rule. The game starts with the Emperor attacking the city of Fynn, the home of a group that still plan to rebel against him. In the course of this battle, we are presented with Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon, who are trying to flee from this battle, but are intercepted and defeated by the forces of the Empire. Firion, Maria, and Guy are recovered by the Wild Rose Rebellion, who were fleeing the conquest of Flynn, and seek to join in the rebellion to avenge their families, and because, well, somebody needs to get stuff done for the rebellion to succeed. Leon, however, is missing, and his fate is unknown for much of the game. You take on various tasks over the course of the game to help out the rebellion and take on the forces of the Empire. They are a significant foe, and there are many losses over the course of the game for the rebellion. While this story moves away from the Four Crystals lore that the first game had, this game has many aspects that reappear in later games. Even the whole concept of an evil empire that is seeking to rule or destroy the world is something that reappears quite a bit, especially in the Super Nintendo era of Final Fantasy. We also find the introduction of Final Fantasy staples like Cid and Chocobos in this second game, which become recurring features in many of the games moving forward. As I said, I did enjoy the story of the game, but it should be noted that the story, while impressive for the time it was originally released, is still not quite to the level that the series would later attain. While your main cast is actually named and has lines of dialogue in this game, they aren't really very well developed. It's more than the first game, but it's hard to really give many details about what makes each character distinct other than very simple descriptors, like Firion is the leader for some reason, Maria is the girl character, and Guy's vocabulary is pretty limited, but he can somehow talk to animals. Now, while your main cast consists of 3 characters, you typically have a 4th in your party. This means that you will have other characters that join you and lend you a hand throughout your adventure. You'll have allies like Minwu, the White Wizard, Joseph, who very much reminds you of kind of like a monk class from Final Fantasy, and a handful of others. This is interesting from a story point of view, but it does really mess things up from a gameplay point of view that I'll get to in a bit. Even in regards to how this impacts the story, the plot gets a bit predictable, as many of these allies will sacrifice themselves so that you can survive and move forward. This makes it hard for any of the other characters to get a lot of development either, as some you're getting and then losing within a very short amount of time. And they just will kind of wind up feeling they're along for the ride for the next section of game just to give you an extra character in your party. Now, while the characters are not developed much, I do really enjoy how your actions in the game cause retaliation and that the world actually changes during the course of the game. Towns are destroyed and people are killed as the Empire attempts to conquer the world. You're able to retake a captured city over the course of the game, and then you can visit it like a normal town. Things like this do a good job of making the world feel like it is actually active, which is impressive for a retro RPG like this one. Even if the story may be lacking compared to modern games, I still really appreciated the developments that were here when compared to the first game or even other RPGs from this era. Keeping that in mind led me to enjoying the story a good amount, but you may not enjoy it nearly as much if you're looking for something comparable to modern RPGs or even those of the SNES era. While I did enjoy the story of this game better than the first Final Fantasy, the gameplay is where this game falls behind for me. Now you might wonder, how is this game that much different than the first Final Fantasy? It is still a turn-based RPG, and a lot of the systems are very similar. But there are some pretty substantial differences as well. The biggest of these differences is how your stats increase over the course of the game. The first Final Fantasy and many other RPGs, both in and outside of the series, have some sort of level system that involves gaining experience points, and then as you gain experience levels, certain stats are increased. Well, Final Fantasy II, instead of having a level up system, has your stats increased based on how much you use them. Getting hit for damage makes it possible for you to gain more max HP or gain stamina. Attacking has a chance to give you strength. Casting spells will give you a chance to gain max MP and skills like intelligence or spirit, depending on the type of spell you're casting. Intelligence is associated with black magic and spirit is associated with white magic. Now, not only are your stats leveled up this way, but so are your abilities with weapons and spells. As you use weapons and spells, they will gain levels, and that character will do more damage or be more effective when using those weapons or spells. Overall, the system sounds really interesting and like it makes a lot of sense. In practice, though, it just doesn't really work as well as you'd think. It felt that at the original game rate, that you just didn't level up things very fast at all playing normally. This meant you either had to have a significant challenge moving ahead, or you really had to grind to level things up, which can take quite a bit of time to do. Thankfully, the Pixel Remaster edition of the game comes with the ability to increase these rates, and honestly, I would recommend sticking a 2 times rate on to make it so you don't have to grind nearly as much. 4 times makes things way too easy, but for those just wanting to experience the game and the story without a lot of challenge to it, this would be the way to go. This system also really doesn't work well with the constant changing of your 4th party member. If you work on developing that 4th character, they won't be there for very long in the game. But if you don't, they can really struggle to do a lot and be on par with your main 3. So it's this kind of this constant struggle of like, do I build this character up only to have them leave shortly afterwards? Or do you kind of have someone that struggles to really add too much to the battles while you have them? And this is more of an issue later in the game, as Minwu, who's one of the first characters you get to join your party, is actually a bit more developed from the start and has a lot of powerful white magic for you, and he is more powerful than anybody in your party at that point. However, as you kind of progress and as you get stronger, you are often either a little bit stronger or significantly stronger than the people who join your group later on. The system also really struggles with the magic system, particularly with support magic. There are certain spells that just aren't very effective unless they are leveled up. However, to level them up, you need to cast them. And so it means casting certain spells when you don't really need them to level them up so that they can be useful. Spells like, ones to remove certain status ailments. You need to cast them for them to really be able to take care of some of the more difficult ones. But if you don't have a status ailment, then why would you need to cast it? It just makes for a system that has a lot of wasted actions, and that doesn't really make for fun gameplay. Speaking of the magic system, Final Fantasy II does this a bit different as well. Any character can learn any magic, but there is a limit of 16 spells for each character to learn. Now, I never really had a problem with hitting this limit for any of my characters, but it is good to know that the limit is there. To learn a spell, you only have to use a book item on that character and they learn it. Again, with the leveling system in the game, this does favor spells you find earlier on in the game than it does for spells later, unless you spend time leveling them up. The magic system is also different in how you're able to cast these spells. Final Fantasy II gets rid of the so many casts per level of spell that was in the first game, and instead moves to a magic point system. The cost of a spell will be equal to the level of mastery of the spell. So a level 1 spell costs 1 magic point, while a level 7 spell will cost 7 magic points per cast. It's a pretty simple and straightforward way of doing the magic, and personally I thought this was an improvement over the first game. The other main difference difference is not on the combat side, but more on the exploration side. When talking to certain important characters, there is a keyword system in the game. You are then able to use that keyword when talking to other important characters, or even the same character, to get more information about those things. To be honest, I really liked this system, and it felt like the beginnings of modern dialogue trees. I'm honestly surprised that I haven't run across more games that have used a system like this. Maybe that's just so integrated into modern dialogue systems that it's there, you just don't really notice it because it is so integrated into it. But I don't know that there's any other games that I've really played that have used a system quite like this. I felt that the keyword system really helped make you feel like you were actively engaged in the story and gave more direction to the narrative. Again, it does have a slightly older and clunky feel to it, but I did enjoy it overall. One other gameplay element to note is that certain locations are not always accessible in the game. This isn't a huge thing, but if you're trying to find all of the chests or all of the enemies, you might be out of luck if you miss one and leave one of these locations. I was trying to work through the PS4 version to get trophies and realized this the hard way, so I wound up starting over from the beginning again to make sure to hit these places I missed. It wasn't really a thing in the first game, so it is something to be aware of here. For those who have played Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster, the rest of the game will feel very similar. It has the same brand of turn-based combat and a world of towns and dangerous locations to explore. Final Fantasy II also includes all of the extras in the Pixel Remaster series with leveling boosts, like I already mentioned, maps, the ability to turn encounters off, a music player, graphical options, and a bestiary. These are all fun additions and are nice from a quality of life point of view, but some you'll probably use more than others. Overall, I really do applaud the attempt that Final Fantasy II made in changing up their systems. They're definitely ones that sound really interesting on paper, but just didn't quite come together in a satisfying way. It's not terrible, but it does bring the game down a little bit. The modern boosts help a good amount, but then the worry is on making the game too easy as you're leveling up too fast in some cases. Personally, I enjoy going through things a bit easier without having to grind a lot, but others may enjoy the grinding and not really enjoy using the boosts as much. The art of the Pixel Remastered series is really nice in Final Fantasy II, just like it was in the first one. It is such a major improvement from the original and brings the game to a more 16-bit-ish presentation than the original 8-bit look. If you've played some of the other remakes of this game, you may not be quite as impressed with how it looks, but the Pixel Remastered version of the game looks really nice and seems to really try to recreate the look of the original by updating the pixel art. Now, growing up with the pixel styles myself, I've always been fond of the style and it looks really nice. Of course, having never played Final Fantasy II before, I also don't have a lot to compare to. I know it's a good upgrade from the Famicom version screenshots I've seen, but others may like the looks of other remakes a bit better. The music is also remastered for Final Fantasy II, like in all of the Pixel Remastered collection. Much like the first game, you can choose to play with the original soundtrack or this remastered version of it. Personally, unlike the first game, I didn't really mess with this, as I don't have the nostalgia associated with this soundtrack like I did with the first game. I still did really enjoy the remastered soundtrack though. Due to my lack of hearing many of these songs before, it didn't have quite as much impact on me because, with the first game I was like, oh, this sounds like what I remember, even though, it's obviously updated, but I could kind of hear the melody of the original in it. And I didn't have that connection to this game, but it is still a Final Fantasy game and pretty much all of these soundtracks are amazing. And Final Fantasy II is really no exception to that. It has some very good music that you're going to enjoy. Final Fantasy II ran great for me. I didn't have any issues with crashes or bugs during my gameplay. I was playing on the PlayStation 4, so I didn't have any issues on that version. Final Fantasy II is a game that had big dreams and really pushed into some very interesting directions. I feel like it had some really innovative ideas and concepts that weren't quite as successful as what they sounded like they should be on paper. Leveling up stats, weapons, and magic based on the actions you took or what happened to you in combat sounds like a good idea, but in reality created a system that was more grindy feeling than anything else. Yes, the boosts in the Pixel Remaster series help this, but I'm not entirely sure if that's a compliment for the game or not. While the gameplay didn't quite live up to the potential I felt that it had, I did enjoy seeing the story take on a stronger narrative. While still maybe a bit lacking by today's standards, it would have been very impressive when released, adding in a fledgling dialogue system with the keywords, and it felt like a game that was really pushing innovations for the time of release. Again, the story doesn't quite reach the standards of today, but I can appreciate it for what it was attempting in its initial release. With these aspects of the game in mind, I'm giving Final Fantasy II Pixel Remaster a 7 out of 10. The story is a big step forward for me compared to the first game, but the attempts to push the gameplay in interesting new directions just didn't quite work out for me. The Pixel Remaster version is solid and very good for those who want to experience the game, especially for those like me who had never played through it yet. But the narrative probably isn't going to hook too many people if you're coming to this game for the first time in 2023. It's hard to fault the game too much for this, but it doesn't make it any less true. Final Fantasy II may not quite live up to the first game, but I still feel like it has an important place in the progression of the Final Fantasy series. It introduces elements like chocobos and Cid for the first time, but also presents a story that serves as at least what feels like an inspiration for later games in the Final Fantasy series that, in my opinion, wind up achieving what Final Fantasy II attempted in that storytelling. Final Fantasy II feels like a game that was a bit before its time and just failed to be able to reach the vision of what it wanted to be, given the limitations of the Famicom. The Pixel Remaster version of the game is a fine way to adventure through this good but flawed experience. I would definitely say it's a game worth playing, but it's probably not going to be anyone's favorite RPG or even Final Fantasy entry.